Hello, I'm Mark Bruzonsky. I'm your host for this program, Mideast Realities. Thank you for tuning in this week. Normally, we are either on location or we have a guest, an expert, who I interview and discuss the realities of the Middle East with. This is a low-budget program, normally showing on public access television, but we've managed to be on location in Jericho with Palestinians, in Cairo with the Egyptians. We've been in Jerusalem, and we've been at various conferences that take place here in Washington. But this week, rather than being on location or rather than interviewing a guest, we're going to, this week and next actually, discuss the Mideast peace process. The reason we have a question mark after that is because after you listen to this program this week and next, you may have some questions about whether it's really a peace process, just like myself and many other experts do. The way we're going to do that is I'm actually going to read you some quotations from major personalities around the world, all of whom are either professors at major universities or journalists or well-recognized experts. You may find these quotes quite extraordinary because they're very pessimistic, they're very gloomy, they tell a story that you do not normally hear told on American television and the mass media. And that, in fact, of course, is the reason we have this program, Mideast Realities, because the fact of the matter is that the mass media, for a variety of complex reasons, oftentimes, especially in foreign policy contexts and especially in regard to the Middle East, does not reflect the actual realities of what's taking place in the Middle East or the actual realities of what's taking place in American foreign policy. Why don't we get started with an example? This quote is from Professor Edward Said, cover article, The Nation magazine in October of 1995. The cover article is titled The Mirage of Peace. Let me just tell you a word about Professor Said. He was born in Palestine, I believe, and as a very young man, the family fled to Cairo, where he was educated. They came here to the United States quite some time ago. He's extremely well known throughout the world, actually, with many, many books on this subject. He is professor of comparative literature at Columbia University, and frankly, one of the most articulate, one of the most interesting, one of the most independent and knowledgeable experts on subjects relating to Israel-Palestine situation in the Middle East. Now listen to what he has to say. Quote, "There is a wanton murder of language evident in the phrase peace process. If you don't sign now," State Department coordinator for the peace process, Ambassador Dennis Ross, told Yasser Arafat, "you just don't get the $100 million. Ross was on the phone to Arafat, essentially forcing him to sign and sign now, shortly after Arafat had stormed out of meetings with Peres shouting, "We are not slaves." Quote, "At a time when people are suffering and shabby leaders are reaping Nobel Prizes that only enable more exploitation, it is crucial to bear witness to the truth. As Palestinians, we must ask whether our century of struggle should conclude not with a state and not with a democracy, but with an awful caricature of both." Quote, "Far from bringing peace, the new PLO-Israel Accord will bring greater suffering for Palestinians and an assured threat to the long-term interests of the Israeli people." Now, I've had to paraphrase and pick out little parts of a very major article that goes on for 8 pages. As I said, it's a cover article in The Nation magazine. Here's an eminent gentleman, a gentleman who's fought most of his adult life for Palestinian rights, for decency, for justice. And yet, here is his analysis of the so-called peace process. Unfortunately, this is not an analysis that you will hear on mainstream American television. I know Edward Said. In fact, I know most of the people whose quotes I'm going to be reading you during these programs. I have no doubt that he's saying these things because they are deeply felt, because he's deeply committed to peace and justice in the Middle East. He's an extremely moderate, extremely reasonable, extremely articulate and rational and intelligent man. And yet just think about what he's said here. He's said that in his judgment, the Palestinians are getting neither a state nor democracy, but an awful caricature of both. He has said essentially that Yasser Arafat has been bribed and pushed and cajoled into signing agreements, even after he has stormed out of meetings saying we'd be slaves if we signed agreements like this. He's suggesting that in the long term, this is not in fact going to lead to peace, but to actually a threat to both the welfare of the Palestinians and the welfare of the Israelis. But let me go on. Let's take the next quote. Professor Noam Chomsky, giant figure, one of the most eminent and well-known political analysts, theorists, linguists in the world. In fact, just as a little aside, I can recall some years ago we made a documentary about Noam Chomsky in 1991. And I recall being in London one day with a little time to do some bookstore browsing on Charing Cross Road. And I recall going into a little bookstore on world affairs, and all the shelves were organized by geography, by region, Africa, Latin America, and Middle East. But there was one, just one exception that I saw on the shelves, because there was an entire section for Noam Chomsky. He has published so many interesting, vibrant, unique books about world affairs, the Middle East being among his specialties. Let me read you what he has to say. Quote, "The agreements incorporate the extremist version of U.S.-Israeli rejectionism. The long-term settlement is to be based solely on UN 1967 Security Council Resolution 242, with no recognition of Palestinian national rights. Furthermore, as Israel and the U.S. have made clear, withdrawal will be partial, as they determine. The settlement they have outlined falls well within the framework of the various rejectionist Israeli proposals from the Alon Plan of '68 to the Sharon and Labor Plans of 1992, all of which developed one or another version of the idea that Israel will retain effective control over the territories, including the resources, particularly water, and the desirable lands. The area around the rapidly expanding Greater Jerusalem, which will effectively split the West Bank into cantons, as well as the Jordan Valley, perhaps a third of the Gaza Strip, and whatever else Israel chooses to incorporate, all with the blessing and financing of its superpower patron, of course, the United States. Meanwhile, Israel will free itself from the need to administer heavily populated Palestinian areas, as rational expansionists have long advocated, and it will seek to establish normal relations with the major countries of the region, becoming a technological, industrial, and financial center while maintaining its predominance backed by the U.S. Quote, "These are the contours of the current plans, euphemisms aside. The basic elements were captured quite realistically by Tanya Reinhardt in Haaretz," that's one of Israel's top newspapers, when she pointed out that it is an error to compare the current arrangement with the end of apartheid in South Africa. Rather, they should be compared to the institution of that monstrous system, with its home rule provisions for new independent states as they were viewed by South African racists and their most loyal friends. Well, here you've got Noam Chomsky outlining what he takes to be the actual realities of the situation, as opposed to the hype and the drama that we're all subjected to in White House ceremonies and speeches. We'll come back to this discussion of the realities of the Mideast peace process in just a moment, but as we've started to do in our programs each week now, let's go to this week's quote of the week. This week's quote of the week is from Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, but not when he's speaking to the cameras, not when he is speaking to the world, rather when he's speaking reportedly at an Israeli cabinet meeting. Quote, "We are doing our best to see that no settler is evacuated. We did not concede on anything that was in our possession. We did not concede on Gaza. Rather, we freed ourselves from Gaza. We did not come to negotiations with the PLO because we have changed, but because it has changed." Now, just as David Ben-Gurion, Peres's mentor, lied to the Palestinians about the intentions to create a separate Jewish state in their country, throughout the 20s and 30s, he lied, always saying that there was no intention of doing so. So Shimon Peres follows in the deceptive tradition of the Israeli Labor Party when it comes to explaining to the world what Israel is really doing as opposed to what Israel says it is doing. Welcome back to Mideast Realities. I'm your host, Mark Bruzonsky. And as I explained to you at the top of the program, this week and next, we're talking about the Mideast peace process, ? We're doing so not by being on location. We've been on location in the Middle East and here in the United States, and not by inviting an expert for a discussion, but rather we have put together some of the most interesting and outspoken quotes from some of the best-known personalities in the world about what the peace process really is, as opposed to what the politicians and what the governments and lobbyists and interest groups try to make you believe the peace process is. And before the break, for the quote of the week, I had just read you a quote from Professor Noam Chomsky, one of the best-known personalities, political analysts in the world, one of the best-known linguists in the world. He teaches at MIT. And he had, the most important part of that quote was, he had compared what is happening in the Middle East today, the peace process, quote-unquote, between Israel and the Palestinians, not with the end of apartheid, as we've just witnessed in recent years in South Africa, but rather, to quote him again, rather, they, the new arrangements, should be compared to the institution of that monstrous system, with its home rule provisions. Let me explain this a bit, since I've been to Palestine, occupied Palestine, Israel, over 100 times in the last 20, 25 years. People who haven't been there don't realize that for a Palestinian to move from one area to another, he not only goes through roadblocks, which are said to be just security checks, but he actually has to have passes, pieces of paper, different colors, different types, different arrangements depending on whether you're a resident of this city or this village or Jerusalem or this area. The Israelis have effectively created a pass system, very similar to what the white South Africans did to keep the blacks in their place, under control, to always know where they are. Plus, in this age of computerization, the Israelis have created a system not only of passes and regulations, but a computerization system so that they can pretty much track individuals, where they go, what checkpoints they go through. When it comes to Gaza, for instance, where over half of the Palestinians who are left in Palestine now live, they are completely bottled up pretty much within the context of a prison situation, with literally barbed and electrified fence surrounding all of Gaza. And only 1 in 100 or less Palestinians have any type of pass at all that lets them ever get out. They can't go to the West Bank, they can't go to Jerusalem, they can't go anywhere. But let's go on. Let me read you a short quote from Professor Israel Shahak. He's an Israeli, teaches at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's a Holocaust survivor. He's a long-time supporter of Palestinian rights, freedom, independence, and democracy. Quote, "In order to let Arafat serve Israeli interests effectively, Israel must salvage his dwindling prestige among Palestinians, and for that purpose leaves him considerable freedom of expression never granted Palestinian collaborators before." Now, the interesting part here is essentially Professor Shahak is calling Yasser Arafat a collaborator. You don't hear this on American television. You don't hear longtime champions, Palestinians, Israelis, Jews, Muslims. You don't hear them on American mass media discussing how Yasser Arafat has become a collaborator in the eyes of many Palestinians, how he's despised in many circles, how he has set up half a dozen protective secret services to protect him and the group of people that are working with him. I was last there a few months ago, in fact, and I was struck. I was prepared for a lot of despair, for a lot of gloom, for a lot of negativism among Palestinian intellectuals and friends of mine who I've known for a long time. I really wasn't prepared for the magnitude of that despair and cynicism. I wasn't prepared for how much people are aware that what's really happening to them is more like what happened to the American Indian than what happens to a people who are getting their independence. This is not Algeria in the 60s when the French left and the Algerians declared independence. This is more like when the Americans put the Indians on reservations, claiming those reservations were independent and sovereign, but of course we all know the history of what has taken place. All right, I have a number of other very interesting quotes, at least I think so, to share with you and to try to analyze with you. But let's break now for our Mideast Realities Lie of the Week. This week's lie of the week is inherent in the juxtaposition of two quotes from the Washington Post that appeared on the same day, on different pages. The day is the 12th of October, the anniversary of the American invasion of Haiti. The first quote is from page A25. Here it is. 1 year and more than $3 billion later, Haiti looks the same as usual. A one-party state where the powerful govern by terror. Quote, credible evidence, says Senator Robert J. Dole, points to political killings and death squads being run by members of the Haiti government, unquote. Switch a few pages. Same day, same newspaper, page C3. Quote, the stars will shine at tonight's celebration marking the first anniversary of democracy's return to Haiti. Actress Julia Roberts, singer Harry Belafonte, actor Danny Glover, and director Jonathan Demme. The revels are sponsored by Trans-Africa, the Center for International Policy, the Organization of American States, at whose 17th Street headquarters the party will be held, and the Congressional Human Rights Black Caucus, unquote. Now, to really understand and appreciate how the American empire conducts its foreign policy, oftentimes making the words democracy synonymous with tyranny, one has to appreciate the broad linkages, whether the subject is democracy in Haiti or democracy and elections for Palestinians. Welcome back to Mideast Realities. As you know, I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host, and as you know, we're discussing the peace process question mark this week. So far, I've read you a quote and tried to explain it and analyze it from Professor Edward Said at Columbia University, a Palestinian American, one of the most articulate, knowledgeable people in the world on this subject. And he called the peace process the wanton murder of language. He talked about the accord not leading to peace, but making things worse for the Palestinians and eventually becoming a threat to Israel. And he said that it's crucial to bear witness to the truth. Then I read you a quote from Professor Noam Chomsky, who described the agreements as nothing more than a long-time continuance of long-term Israeli policies, basically rejecting Palestinian national rights, basically fulfilling long-term Israeli ambitions, basically letting Israel call the shots, keep whatever territories and resources it wants. And then, most tellingly, he went on to compare what's happening today as the institution of a system similar to what used to be apartheid in South Africa, but this time it's really apartheid for Palestinians under the guise of the term separation that Rabin is fond of using. And then we discussed Professor Israel Shahak's views, a Holocaust survivor himself, a professor at Hebrew University, an Israeli, a long-time supporter of Palestinian rights and previously of the PLO. But his phrase for Yasser Arafat these days is that he's become a Palestinian collaborator. Well, let me share with you finally this week, and then next week we have a number of other very interesting and very telling quotes. Let me share with you now the views of a Palestinian living in the Israeli-occupied areas of Palestine in the West Bank. Professor Abdul Sittar Qasim teaches political science at Al-Najjar University in Nablus, one of the biggest Palestinian cities. Here's what he has to say. Quote, "I don't think that self-autonomy will serve Palestinian rights. It's anti-Palestinian. It's anti-rights. We haven't received anything. Now we are the slaves for the Zionists. We are like General Anton Lahad. For those of you who don't know, Lahad is head of the puppet South Lebanese army that Israel established after the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. We are," going back to Professor Qasim's quote, "we are defending the security of Israel. What we've gotten from self-autonomy is very similar to what Anton Lahad is doing, running the health and educational institutions and so on. Also, he's helping keep Israel's borders secure. This is what we too are doing, and I ask, is this what we fought so hard for? We have national political rights, and we do not receive them. If we do not receive them, we are not ready to be servants for Israel." Professor Qasim has actually been quite an outspoken critic of the agreements of Yasser Arafat, of what's become of the PLO, and he's paid quite a price for it. This is also something that you need to know if you want to understand the realities of what's taking place in today's Middle East and in the context of what's called the peace process. Professor Qasim actually was shot 4 times by Palestinian Authority, plainclothes police, goons, call them what you like. The attempt was to assassinate him, to silence him. The attempt was to intimidate everyone else from speaking up. There's tremendous amounts of intimidation now of Palestinians. They're afraid to publish, they're afraid to speak up, they're afraid to articulate their grievances, their real views, and that, of course, is a major aspect of what the peace process is all about. It's an attempt to bring a group of Palestinian collaborators, if you like, call them a client regime, if you like. The West, throughout this century, has set up client regimes in various countries in the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia to Kuwait to Egypt to Tunisia to Morocco. The attempt has always been to divide and rule, to put in place regimes that can be used and manipulated by the West, because the resources of the Middle East are the oil, the money, the petrodollars of the Middle East are wanted by the Western countries. Thus, the region has to be controlled, the prices kept artificially low, the supply kept artificially high. Then, of course, in the Israeli-Palestinian context, the Israelis have, for generations now, tried to find Palestinians they could work with, manipulate, use. So essentially what's been happening in the guise of the peace process is that Yasser Arafat, bankrupt, penniless, discredited, many of his most senior lieutenants assassinated by Israel over the year, all of his policies discredited, his PLO crumbling. He was unable in the months before the so-called breakthrough at Oslo to even keep the Palestinian offices and institutions open and pay the salaries. He had been a total and utter failure as a leader. And what has happened is the Israelis essentially resurrected him, used him, bought him. As Edward Said said in his opening quote, one day Yasser Arafat was screaming, "We will not be slaves." The next hour or two, he was getting calls from the American State Department telling him, either you come and you sign the deal, or you don't get your $100 million, and all that we've expected and promised you is not going to take place. Well, he came, he pretended under those circumstances that he had signed this great deal. He waved the 400-page document over his head. He tried to make jokes. But even on that day, the ceremony was put back for 20 minutes because the deal hadn't been finalized and Rabin and Arafat were still arguing. I'm Mark Bruzonsky. I'm your host for this program. Thank you for tuning in to Mideast Realities. Please come back next week. We're going to continue this discussion of the realities of the Israeli-Palestinian quote-unquote peace process, ?